It's around the year 830, and a man sits languishing in a Baghdad prison. He isn't a thief or a bandit, but a highly regarded scholar. His name is Hunayn ibn Ishaq, and he's widely considered his generation's greatest translator of ancient Greek texts, as well as a talented doctor. In fact, he's the personal physician to the Muslim caliph al-Ma'mun. And it's on the caliph's orders that Ibn Ishaq, whose name means son of Isaac, has been in prison for the past year. But why? Ibn Ishaq is a Christian, but that's no crime, and al-Ma'mun knew about the man's faith before he made him his personal doctor. So what is his offence? It is this, that al-Ma'mun had ordered Ibn Ishaq to prepare a poison so that the caliph could kill one of his enemies, and the doctor refused, saying it went against his oath as a doctor to save life, not to take it. Well, it may have taken a year in prison and regular interrogations, but the caliph has now decided that the physician has proved himself unimpeachably honest. And from this point forth, al-Ma'mun heaps honours and riches on his medical doctor. Ibn Ishaq will return to his duties and, even more importantly, is appointed the head of translation in the House of Wisdom. Established by al-Ma'mun's father, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the House of Wisdom was the world's preeminent centre for translation and original research at this time. The translation movement in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, from about 750 to 1258, was the ambitious attempt to translate Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, Chinese and other written sources of knowledge into Arabic at an almost frenzied pace, producing multiple translations and commentaries on countless ancient texts. In turn, this protected previous scholarship and created much that was new. Let me start this lecture by asking two questions. One, precisely why was all of this translation work important to the caliphs who commissioned it? And second, why did it take place when it did? After addressing these two questions, we'll move on to consider the work of two of the great names of Arab translation at this time. Al-Kindi, who's often called the father of Arabic philosophy, and Ibn Ishaq, whom we just met in prison. And we'll close by examining the legacy of the Arabic translation movement on its successor, the Latin translation movement, which took place in Western Europe during the 12th century and beyond. Preserving this knowledge was an important bequest to human knowledge. Without it, it's entirely plausible to say that the world would have lost numerous ancient texts that today we hail as the foundation stones of Western culture. Indeed, without the translation movement sponsored by the Sunni Muslim caliphs known as the Abbasids, who built Baghdad and made it the centre of their Muslim empire in its day, it's likely that we never would have had access to the philosophy of Aristotle, Euclid's geometry, or Galen's medical texts, to mention just three Greek authors. We should remember that Islam had only recently emerged in 622 in a remote and relatively unimportant bit of Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632, and 100 years later, the Umayyads, that is, the predecessors to the Abbasids, found themselves ruling over a tri-continental empire that was the largest the world had ever seen up until that time. Yet the newly ascendant Arab Muslims also felt their cultural backwardness acutely. And the collapse of the Umayyad dynasty in 750 marked the end of an era of political unity that held sway across most of the Muslim world since the death of Muhammad. Now, it would be wrong to imagine that the Umayyads in Damascus, who ruled before the Abbasids in Baghdad, had absolutely no interest in foreign language texts. We know, for instance, that the Umayyads commissioned translations of several medical and astronomical works, just on nothing like the scale of the Abbasids. It's also true that the Umayyads didn't translate any Greek philosophical works. Rather, they might deliberately have avoided Greek philosophy, focusing instead on more practical works. It's possible that the Umayyads were wary of the potential that these alien philosophical ideas had to negatively impact Islam, which at the time was still a relatively new and dogmatically flexible faith. Early Muslim thinkers, as also was the case with some early Christian writers, often considered the pagan writers from ancient Greece with a degree of uncertainty, if not hostility. The thought then, and sometimes now, was, why should Islamic scholars translate, study, discuss, and disseminate the philosophical musings of pagan writers after the revelation of monotheism, as passed down in Jewish, Christian, and later Muslim sacred texts? But now let's visit the House of Wisdom in Baghdad at the start of the 9th century. The Abbasids selected Baghdad as the site of their new capital, as much for its geographical advantages on a fertile plain between two rivers, as for political reasons. It was a clever move, placing them closer to the Persian heartland, befitting the large number of Persian speakers the administrative apparatus relied upon, and further from the Umayyad loyalists in the eastern Mediterranean littoral. Indeed, the Abbasids were eager adopters of almost everything Persian, including the Persian tradition of translations. With talented Arabs, Jews, Christians, and non-Arab specialists from the Middle East and beyond all contributing, the quantity and variety of works translated during this period was staggering, including books on algebra, geometry, metaphysics, and logic, and endless treatises on astronomy and astrology. It's said that on one occasion, when the Caliph al-Ma'mun sent a mission to bring texts back from Khorasan, or northern Persia, the camel caravan that marched into Baghdad consisted of 100 animals just to carry the manuscripts. Dissatisfied, however, with the rate at which his own translators could convert foreign texts into Arabic, al-Ma'mun sent diplomatic missions to the Muslim Emir of Sicily and the Christian Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, sending them both the same request: please send me copies of every book you've got in your libraries. The Muslim Emir and the Christian Emperor were both, in a very real sense, political rivals of al-Ma'mun, yet they had the courtesy and open-mindedness to comply with this request, as far as they were able to. Like other examples, this belies the enduring myth of the so-called clash of civilizations between the Muslim and Christian worlds. Once in Baghdad, the texts would be translated to Arabic and then pored over by the Baghdadian scholars. And in this way, hundreds of years of commentary and revisions would be added to the translated texts over the course of the Golden Age. Now, these translators and scholars who worked in the House of Wisdom needed and expected to be paid for their time and expertise, and they weren't left wanting. Successive caliphs paid handsomely, keeping the scholars happy and tempting more and more talented scholars to join them from across the Muslim world and beyond. This generosity peaked under al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833. Scholars could expect to be paid the weight of a text in gold for each work they translated under al-Ma'mun. I've not managed to track down the origin of the English expression that something is worth its weight in gold, but for translators working in the House of Wisdom, it was literally true. One of the greatest scholars of the entire Islamic Golden Age was a man named Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq as-Saba al-Qindi. In translation, this rather lengthy name means father of Joseph, Jacob, son of Isaac, of the morning, and the Kinda tribe. Born In the southern Iraqi city of Basra in about 801, al-Kindi moved to Baghdad, where he would become the senior-most scholar and sometime head of translation in the House of Wisdom. He stood out for the breadth and depth of his scholarship in a period before fields of study were rigidly separated. At the heart of al-Kindi's studies, and thus his reputation, are his philosophical writings, which drew heavily on ancient Greek learning. Indeed, al-Kindi's relationship with the philosophical writings of the likes of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus was based on his own translations of these philosophers. And it's thanks directly to his translations that we have as much of that Greek wisdom available to us as we do. Al-Kindi's own philosophical inquiries emulated those of Aristotle, which is why he's also considered the first of the Muslim peripatetic philosophers, i.e., a student or follower of Aristotle. Even as a young man, he was confident of his own intellectual powers and respected for them. Consider this account of his attendance at a weekly salon that the Caliph himself attended, where he'd listen to scholars debate and join in with his own questions. The proximity of how close one sat to the Caliph was an indication of status. On this occasion, the young al-Kindi supposedly took a seat very close to the Caliph al-Ma'mun, above a certain older, more prominent theologian. The older man called out, "How dare you? What right do you have to sit above me?" Al-Kindi replied, "Because I know what you know, but you don't know what I do." The Caliph al-Ma'mun sometimes thought and worried about the possible conflicts between his religious faith and the ancient teachings that predated it. In other words, what place was there for logic in a world that had been revealed through Muhammad as God's creation? Was there an inherent contradiction between faith and reason? Well, according to one account of al-Ma'mun's troubled musings on the subject, he fell asleep, only to dream of encountering a smiling Aristotle who said to him, "There is no conflict. Reason and religion are allies, not enemies." Upon awakening, al-Ma'mun was said to have been refreshed and reassured, and to have redoubled his efforts to make the House of Wisdom a world-class centre of learning. Al-Kindi, a devout Muslim like the Caliph, apparently never saw any conflict between his religious faith and the central tenets of Greek philosophy, reason and logic. Indeed, al-Kindi believed in the compatibility between the philosophy of the ancients and the so-called Islamic sciences, such as Quranic studies, which are akin to biblical studies in the Christian tradition, and which were at the heart of most of his writings. Incorporating a form of Neoplatonic rationalism, al-Kindi believed that religious books, and even the Quran, could be understood on different levels without inherent contradiction. So, for instance, whereas educated scholars might understand the allegorical nature of the Quran, the masses, lacking the equivalent education or insight, might understand it more literally. Regrettably, the idea of faith trumping reason would come to dominate much Islamic theology in time. Al-Kindi's translations and research roamed well beyond philosophy and religion. In addition to his translations of Greek texts, he authored some 230 original works, and was the first Arab to produce a comprehensive ordering of the different branches of science then practiced. And here's another remarkable thing. Al-Kindi's book, entitled On Decrypting Encrypted Correspondence, was the most advanced work on codes and code breaking in history until the Second World War, according to David Kahn, a US historian of cryptography. The secret of al-Kindi's success in the field we think of today as cryptography was his original study of frequency analysis. Frequency analysis is a branch of mathematics that originated in the Muslim Middle East, and which considers the frequency of letters or groups of letters in any given text in order to break a cipher or code. Yet it might surprise you to hear that Al-Kindi was also a dedicated believer in astrology, that pseudoscience that imagines the relative position of the stars and planets can somehow impact events on Earth. That said, he also made a distinction between what he believed was genuine and false astrology. And he was a fierce critic of alchemy, that medieval predecessor of chemistry whose adherents believed it possible to convert base metals such as lead into precious ones like gold under the right laboratory conditions. Although alchemy is seen today as yet another pseudoscience, it was once taken very seriously indeed, not only by some of the greatest minds during the Islamic Golden Age, but also by Greek scholars after Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC, and as late as 18th century England. For instance, Sir Isaac Newton was a believer in alchemy. Al-Kindi, to his credit, derided alchemy as a pseudo-scientific refuge for those who were more interested in get-rich-quick schemes than they were in science. But now let's turn to Hunayn ibn Ishaq, whom we originally met at the beginning of this lecture, incarcerated under the watchful eye of the Caliph. As I said at the start of this lecture, Ibn Ishaq was an Arab Christian, specifically a Nestorian Christian. Believing that Jesus had distinct and separate human and divine natures, Nestorianism emerged from what we now call Eastern Christianity. In spite of his faith, Ibn Ishaq was the Caliph's doctor and the head of translation in the newly established House of Wisdom. As such, he's rightly considered the spiritual founder of the translation movement. And he was known as Sheikh al-Mutara Jamina, or head of the translators. Not only did Ibn Ishaq convert more foreign texts than any other scholar of his time, he also improved translation methods, leaving behind a set of principles and practices that are still widely followed to this day. Probably the most important of his translations were the works of the 2nd century philosopher and surgeon Aelius Galenus, or Claudius Galenus, who was better known as Galen of Pergamon. Galen was born in that part of the Greek world that's now Turkey, but he settled in Rome. Galen's surviving work accounts for about half of all extant ancient Greek literature, and what survives today, roughly 3 million words, is thought to be no more than a third of what he actually wrote or dictated to scribes. Now, Galen wasn't translated directly from Greek into Latin in the ancient world, so it's largely thanks to Ibn Ishaq and his team of translators, including his son, nephew and others, that we have what we do of his medical works. Even today, much of Galen's work exists only in Arabic or in later medieval Latin translations of those Arabic texts. In addition to the translations of Galen, Ibn Ishaq and his team managed also to translate the complete works of Hippocrates, the Greek physician in the age of Pericles. And like Hippocrates, going against prevailing norms, Ibn Ishaq believed that diseases had natural rather than divine causes. Ibn Ishaq also translated Plato's Republic, most of Aristotle, and the entire Greek language version of the Old Testament. This latter work hasn't survived, unfortunately. As one of the earliest translations of the Old Testament, it would have been a singularly important text. But now, let's get to Ibn Ishaq's methods of translation. When Ibn Ishaq started working in the House of Wisdom, the usual practice was to translate a text literally, word for word, regardless of how this might sound in the new target language. Ibn Ishaq understood that such an approach wasn't suitable if one was interested in conveying the sense as well as the literal meaning of a text. Fluent in Syriac, Greek, Arabic and Persian, Ibn Ishaq argued that an effective translator must possess not just an impressive degree of language fluency, but also an understanding of idiom, nuance, and possible inferences in every word. In this way, it was possible that a translator might produce a useful and authentic interpretation as opposed to an adequate facsimile of the original. In short, Ibn Ishaq believed that a translator's job was to understand and convey the original meaning of a work beyond the sum of its individual parts. And this is what Ibn Ishaq and his team managed to do. To achieve this aim, Ibn Ishaq insisted that members of his team read various other works in the original language before work began on a translation. In this, he showed a clear understanding that the meanings of words can change over time, and that words can have different uses or nuances depending on the context and the type of text. So, for instance, a word used in a work of human anatomy, let's say the word heart, may have a completely different meaning when used in the middle of a metaphysical treatise, or again in a book of metallurgy. Working in a team environment proved useful to Ibn Ishaq and the other members, as they combined their talents and checked each other's work. For instance, Ibn Ishaq might translate a work by Galen from the Greek into his mother tongue, Syriac, which is a form of the Aramaic language and once common throughout the region. Then, his son would translate his Syriac into Arabic, while the nephew would compare both translations, hunting for possible errors and suggesting improvements. Ibn Ishaq's fluency in numerous languages, along with his professional legacy, brought about by the large number of texts he translated, and the subsequent legacy for human wisdom, all demonstrate that he was a most talented individual. And so, while the Arab-Muslim al-Kindi enjoyed the role and status of senior scholar in the House of Wisdom, the Caliph al-Ma'mun was only too happy to appoint Ibn Ishaq, an Arab Nestorian Christian, as head of translation. Of course, accurate translation remains important right down to the present day. I'm thinking now of a hand-painted sign I once saw in the street outside a hospital in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Arabic language doesn't have the equivalent of a letter P, which is where the confusion occurred in the mind of the person responsible for this particular sign. Instead of reading "no parking," it actually said "no barking," which made the notice of greater note to any rowdy dogs that might have passed by, rather than anyone thinking of leaving their car in that spot. In bringing this lecture to a close, I want to be certain to touch upon a few other things and to make them clear. After it was founded in the second half of the 8th century, Baghdad emerged as the flourishing centre of translation and scholarship in the Muslim world. But it wasn't the only one. Other competing centres of learning arose in what's known as Fatimid Cairo in the 10th century and in Muslim Andalusia or modern Spain during the same period. Another thing that's worth underscoring is that in most cases, those translators working in the House of Wisdom weren't just translators of knowledge from the Hellenic or Greek-speaking world, Persia, China, India, and elsewhere. A wealth of original scholarship was also undertaken. And the era's greatest translators, including al-Kindi and Ibn Ishaq, were responsible for some of the greatest original scholarship during the Islamic Golden Age. The British-American historian Bernard Lewis once observed that of all pre-modern empires, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates of the Muslim Middle East were the richest and most diverse. Before the rise of Islam, Lewis says, virtually all civilizations in China, India, Europe, and the Americas were limited to one region, one culture, and usually one race. The Islamic culture of the Middle East was the first that was truly international, intercultural, interracial, in a sense even intercontinental. And its contribution, both direct and indirect, to the modern world is immense. The Umayyads and Abbasids alike, as Muslim believers, contented themselves with the idea that they were God's chosen people. Yet, when they saw the cities of Persia next door and others beyond, they knew they had next to none of the cultural tools of other great civilizations. To their credit, as we see in the House of Wisdom, they did something about it. These men inherited the wisdom of Babylon, Egypt, Persia, and Greece. They made it their own and eventually passed on the intellectual baton to Europe. And the global knowledge they collected from East and West, and which they translated and transmitted, is truly astonishing. Indian numerals and Chinese paper both came to Europe via the Middle East at this time. Together, they would help propel the European Renaissance, as well as both modern science and literature. And like it or not, European scholars before, during, and after the start of the Renaissance in 14th century Florence were dependent on the original scholarship of the Arabs and their partners, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and others. To quote Bernard Lewis again, he wrote, "In time, Arab scholarship helped to illuminate the outer darkness of the lands beyond the northwest frontier of Islam. Arabic works, some original, some adopted from ancient Greek texts, were translated into Latin. European students went to study in the academies of what were then Muslim cities of Spain and Sicily." The evidence of the polyglot nature of Umayyad Andalusia from the 9th century onwards, where one could expect to hear Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and the local Romance languages, would, by the 12th century, see the emergence of a new, thriving translation movement that rescued Western Europe from the so-called Dark Ages. And just as Jews and Christians, with their non-Arabic languages, were at the vanguard of Baghdad's 9th century translation movement, Spain's large Arabic-speaking Christian community led translation efforts there. After the 1085 conquest of Toledo in modern-day Spain by Christian forces, the new rulers inherited and preserved vast libraries that contained some of the leading scientific and philosophical thought from ancient Greece and Rome, and also from the Muslim Middle East.